Right, good morning everybody. I'm here to lecture to you this morning on Daniel Defoe's novel Robinson Crusoe. Several of you have said to me that you're very much looking forward to this lecture, so I hope I'm going to be able to live up to your expectations. At the end of the lecture, the presentation that I'm using and a copy of my lecture will be made available to you electronically on Moodle. So make notes, but be aware that you'll have access to everything that I'm saying after the lecture. Okay, the lecture is going to be in three parts, and the first part will look at biographical and historical contexts behind the production of Robinson Crusoe. The second part of the lecture will look at literary and critical contexts, and the third part of the lecture will be concerned with Robinson Crusoe, the novel itself. There's a clip on the PowerPoint that you can look at in your own time from a film version of Robinson Crusoe. You may find that interesting. But for the time being, biographical and historical contexts. Daniel Defoe was born in 1660, the year of the beginning of the restoration of the British monarchy after the English Civil War. His father was a tallow chandler, somebody who sold animal fat candles for use in people's homes. That may be why Robinson Crusoe has the foresight to take with him a large lump of beeswax when he escapes from slavery in Salé. Salé is now Rabat in Morocco, before being marooned on the island. The Defoe family lived in Cripplegate, in the heart of the City of London, next to the present-day Barbican complex. And for anybody who's interested, that's where John Milton is buried as well. The family were merchants. Tallow makers belonged to one of the merchants' guilds, and they were Presbyterian Protestants in an area dense with business and trade. Presbyterianism might benefit from some explanation here because it would affect Daniel Defoe's life and inform everything that he wrote. The Presbyterian Church originated in Scotland and grew out of the strict doctrines of Calvinism, which included a belief in predestination. The Presbyterian Church emphasized, and still does because it thrives today, particularly in Scotland and North America, the absolute sovereignty of God, the authority of the scriptures, and the necessity of redemption, not through voluntary good acts, but by grace and faith in Jesus Christ. Their doctrine was one that stressed personal responsibility and obedience to God's word. Robinson Crusoe constantly addresses his feelings of failure in that respect. Presbyterians do not have bishops or a hierarchical clergy, but are governed by elected councils. And you can think about how that would fit in with your studies of political science so far in the Enlightenment. What ways can we see these religious beliefs informing Defoe's political inclinations and the things that he wrote in Robinson Crusoe? Well, throughout the novel, different situations of empowerment, of disenfranchisement, and confession repeatedly occur. In business, in the colonies, in conditions of slavery, and on the island, in a number of forms. They also occur in tropes of rescue. All of those situations connect religious piety and, conversely, the willful disobedience of God with civil and moral action. Crusoe constantly revisits his own instances of disobedience, first to his father and second to God. Presbyterians were not members of the Anglican Church of England, the official church of the monarchy and state, of which the reigning monarch was the head and defender of the faith. They were one sect amongst a number that were called dissenting religious sects, members of churches that declined to follow the creed and communion of the Church of England, and in doing so put the religious advice of their own elected representatives above that of the monarch and his bishopric. Presbyterians, like most dissenting sects, were politically active, supporting the parliamentarian side in the English Civil War. Therefore, they were amongst the losers when the Republic failed and when the monarchy was reinstated with Charles II, albeit with a stronger parliament. Defoe's family held to their beliefs, and Daniel Defoe, he changed his name in 1695, was educated at a London dissenting academy. Such an education encouraged constant personal scrutiny and critical thought about politics and religion. Defoe's religious belief was strong, and he initially planned a career as a dissenting minister. However, at the age of 22, he abandoned that plan and became a hosier, someone defined by the Oxford English Dictionary as a seller of hose, stockings and socks, and of frame-knitted or woven underclothing more generally. Hosier was also a term used generally for a men's outfitter or haberdasher. All of this means that Defoe was born into a particular kind of social world that would be instrumental in major shifts in the structure of English society during the 18th century. As a religious dissenter, he challenged the authority of institutions of state, and he was a member of the commercial middling sort who would transform the economic structure of his own nation. In many ways, Robinson Crusoe becomes a persona for Defoe. He is a projection through fiction of Defoe's own ideas and principles into the world of high adventure. As European shipping became more technically sophisticated, international trade rapidly expanded its geographical range and financial importance. The merchant and trading classes that comprised the middling sort gained in wealth and power, asserting themselves as the engine of economic and social development within the British nation. Furthermore, their businesses and lives were concentrated in the nation's cities, marking another shift, this time away from an agrarian land-based economy dominated by aristocrats towards one centred in trade and manufacture. However, just as landed estates in Britain became more connected with city money and trade during the 18th century, so landed estates overseas in Britain's colonies became increasingly valuable as sources of raw materials and exotic commodities. As an active and successful merchant, Defoe, like his fictional hero Robinson Crusoe, participated fully in England's colonial project. At this point, it is important to think about the manner in which people were commoditized, turned into goods, as part of the process of colonialism through the transatlantic slave trade. And slavery is at the heart of Robinson Crusoe's narrative, both in Crusoe's own experiences, which make light of slavery as something that, well, really isn't too bad and is escapable through ingenuity and even adventurous, and through the insistent justification of the expedience of using African plantation slave labour in colonized nations, represented by Crusoe's own plantations in Brazil. To return to Daniel Defoe's life, he also served in the army and for a time was a government spy. He wrote prolifically fiction, essays, newspaper articles and pamphlets, and was well known as a dissenting writer by the time that he published Robinson Crusoe. Defoe edited and single-handedly produced a pro-government newspaper, The Review, thereby gaining professional expertise as a political journalist, an experience that also contributes to the style he uses in Robinson Crusoe. To conclude this biographical first part of today's lecture, there were negative experiences in Defoe's life leading up to the publication of Robinson Crusoe that we should consider. And most particularly, those experiences include institutional punishment for the transgression of codes of conduct and the removal of Defoe's liberty. He was imprisoned in Newgate Jail for nearly 2 years in 1702 and spent 3 days in the pillory for writing and publishing a pamphlet titled The Shortest Way with Dissenters, or Proposals for the Establishment of the Church. That pamphlet satirically attacked high Toryism, which was the government at the time, and dissenters who practiced occasional Anglicanism so that they could look after their own business interests, those who compromised their faith, in other words, to appease others. You can look for yourselves at a chronology of Daniel Defoe's published work, including his other highly important novels, Moll Flanders, published in 1722, A Journal of the Plague Year, also published 1722, and Roxana, 1724. So Defoe's fiction is published in quite a concentrated, short number of years. In thinking about those novels, I encourage you also to think about the variety of Defoe's writing, the range of literary genres that he uses: travel literature, books on trade and commerce, religious and political pamphlets, everyday political journalism. As a novel of its time and a landmark in the history of English literature as a work of fiction, Robinson Crusoe, published in 1719, should be understood as being in dialogue with those other forms of writing. Now, for the second part of my lecture, I want to look at literary and critical contexts of Robinson Crusoe as an Enlightenment publication and as a work of British literature. And I want to consider how those two aspects of Defoe's novel, an Enlightenment publication and a work of literature, connected writing and the history of ideas. And I've put onto the next slide for you a list of the kinds of writing that we might see if we look at Robinson Crusoe. Within the genre of the novel, there are a number of other different kinds of writing with which Defoe is engaging. The novel is autobiographical to a certain extent. It's a monologue to a certain extent. It's a travelogue. It tells a story of travel, a very popular genre of writing in the 18th century and becoming increasingly popular with British trade expanding around the world and with exploration expanding around the globe. It's an adventure story. I think that's probably quite straightforward. It's also a castaway narrative, and there were a number of other non-fiction castaway narratives that were published in Britain at around about the same time that Defoe wrote this novel. It also uses principles of double-entry bookkeeping, and that will be interesting for any of you who are perhaps working in business studies here. But it also makes a link between the vocabulary and the mentality of business studies and the act of writing literary fiction. Crusoe makes lists, so you have lists of positives and lists of negatives, lists of good things that he's done, lists of things that he feels bad about, and they're set out in the way that you would look at a set of accounts with a debit and a credit side to them. Robinson Crusoe is often cited as the first English novel. Now, that distinction is debatable. However, the genre of fiction and the novel as a new form of writing is significant to the Enlightenment function of Robinson Crusoe. Daniel Defoe uses fiction and narrative storytelling as means of responding to issues that were more usually addressed in a variety of other established genres. The non-fiction travel writing that I've already mentioned, the political pamphlets that I've referred to, writing about religion, commerce, and politics. The British public was already very familiar with those forms of writing, and they met a recognisable demand. So why the novel? Well, the emergence of the novel as a significant form of writing in the 18th century results in part from the very shifts in society that I have already mentioned, namely the rise of a commercial middling sort that had made money through enterprise and were finding themselves with the means to buy literature and the leisure time to read. Ian Watt has argued in The Rise of the Novel that Robinson Crusoe is emblematic of the rise of the ordinary individual in the nation. That is evident, as he points out, because in Robinson Crusoe there is a concern with the daily lives of ordinary people. I just want to just turn on to the next slide there. In turn, he notes that the successes of that concern in the novel depends upon a society that in itself values every individual highly enough to consider him or her the proper subject of serious literature. Furthermore, there must be enough variety of belief and action among ordinary people for them to be of interest to for those characters to be of interest to other ordinary people. Watt further writes that Robinson Crusoe as a character is an embodiment of economic individualism. So it's a fictionalization of the rise of economic individualism that you're reading about in Robinson Crusoe, if you like. Like all of Defoe's heroes, he certainly pursues money and pursues it very methodically according to the profit and loss bookkeeping, which Max Weber considered to be the distinctive technical feature of modern capitalism. The work by Weber that Watt refers to is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, a book that explains how religious Protestant values of duty to God and the self became translated into the secular doctrine of possessive individualism and Western capitalism. Put simply, Max Weber shows how making money evolved initially as a practice consistent with religious piety and worship. You'll probably have noticed that in your reading of Robinson Crusoe, Crusoe keeps those accounts of his ventures, as I've already said, weighing the good and bad experience, religious observance and laxity, in the same ways that he keeps formal double-entry ledgers of his produce and financial affairs. An example can be seen in the two-column account that he produces of good and evil of his condition on the island. Now, Watt concedes in his later study, Myths of Modern Individualism, that the myth of Robinson Crusoe is generally agreed to be based almost entirely on what happens on the island. And I think it would be true to say that most people who think about Robinson Crusoe as a novel think about the island on which Crusoe finds himself. But obviously there's much more to Defoe's fiction than that particular account. The time on the island is significant, but is one amongst many episodes. Of course, the events leading up to that part of the story are as significant to your studies as is what happens on the island and what happens afterwards. The novel as a whole enacts the myth of possessive individualism. It shows how an ordinary man, quite alone, is able to subdue nature to his own material purposes and eventually to triumph over the natural and physical environment in which he finds himself. Robinson Crusoe is someone who learns to exploit every situation in which he finds himself for his own interest. In the context of the island narrative, rational, ecological, and economic labour, Watt notes, can be seen as the moral premises underlying Crusoe's character. Now, Robinson Crusoe further operates as a myth or fable, advocating the wholesale subordination of other people and their lands in the interest of individual capitalism and of national colonial enterprise. Crusoe is an everyman hero, representing the ordinary British individual as a character of enterprise and initiative, who uses his knowledge to gain large amounts of money and power, both for himself and in the interest of the nation to which he ultimately returns. Pat Rogers has tartly described Robinson Crusoe, the character, as a Caribbean nabob who makes a little England in remote surroundings. I would like to consider two more critical essays from your own secondary reading list in this lecture. Manuel Schoenhorn explores the political dimension of Robinson Crusoe's of Daniel Defoe's novel, looking first at how Crusoe seems to underpin monarchical forms of power, only to refute old-style paternal authority in favour of a more constitutional mixed government system. And I hope you can see how that would be consistent with and fit in with the England in which Defoe himself grew up, the England of the Britain of the restoration of the monarchy. In that respect, Robinson Crusoe dramatises through its adventure narratives changes in Britain's system of governance since the English Civil War and Restoration, and onwards through the Glorious Revolution, then consolidated the rule of the Protestant monarchy in the installation of William III. It does not take much critical imagination to read Robinson Crusoe as a political novel concerned with the nature of power and authority. Literary devices, including contradiction, add to the novel's interest at the same time that they address the uncertainties felt by ordinary, middling sorts of tradesmen in England. In Crusoe's constant wavering back and forth between contradictory positions, Schoenhorn sees Defoe engaging with political and personal anxieties of his time. Schoenhorn's analysis of the relationship between Crusoe and Friday demonstrates his point, arguing that the novel attempts to portray Crusoe as a benignly paternal man. At a political level, he writes, Robinson Crusoe asserts that benign paternalism, which is seen to be distinct and different from an older form of patriarchal government. The suggestion is that Defoe prefers a subjective approach to paternalism that prioritizes felt moral responsibility over systematic structures of power. Furthermore, he argues that Crusoe's developing political empire is not coterminous with the natural family, but that it seeks to legitimize a different form of sovereign power for two reasons. Firstly, that power has been gained through conquest, which is not consistent with the regular model of the domestic family. And secondly, because he only artificially, Crusoe that is, performs the nobler part of a parent's duty. All of these critical readings locate Robinson Crusoe firmly within the historical context within which it was written and published, intellectually, socially, politically, and religiously. That context was one in which Britain, then comprising England, Scotland, and Wales, but dominated by England, was ruthlessly and aggressively expanding its commercial, political, and cultural interests around the world. Furthermore, it was doing so in fierce competition with other developed European powers. Crusoe's apparently amicable relationships with Portuguese and Spanish colonialists and ships captains through sea travel, through his establishment of his plantations in Brazil, are always competitive and motivated by self-interest. Martha Nussbaum further reinforces the need to think critically about Robinson Crusoe within its context of literary production, reader reception, and historical context. In her essay, Cultivating Humanity, a classical defense of reform in liberal education, she concurs with Joseph Frank, establishing a critical dialogue that includes her own argument that there are actually multiple dimensions to Defoe's best-known novel, all interrelated and all demanding considerations of specific historical circumstances. To start with, for Nussbaum and Frank, Robinson Crusoe is a novel that had immediate moral, philosophical, and political meaning, in which moral issues in colonialism and slavery were hotly debated. That linking of moral philosophy, colonialism, and the matter of slavery, all issues of the moment in 1719, is made intelligible to the reader through the medium of literary fiction. In other words, their importance is held up for scrutiny through the genre of the novel, a newish form of writing at the time. Defoe uses the device of a historical narrative. He sets his narrative back in time, just beyond living memory, but sufficiently recent to remain relevant to the everyday reader. That enabled the readers to suspend their disbelief over the dramatic events that are narrated. Robinson Crusoe undertakes his first voyage in 1651. To give that an Enlightenment context, it is 2 years after the execution of Charles I, a time when the parliamentarians were decidedly winning the English Civil War, and the year in which Thomas Hobbes published Leviathan. Crusoe sets out on his ill-fated return to Britain from Brazil in 1659, just before the restoration of the monarchy and Defoe's own birth. Remember that Robinson Crusoe was published in 1719, that is, nearly 70 years after Crusoe's initial fictional journey. Nussbaum argues the arts play a vital role, cultivating powers of imagination that are essential to citizenship, and encouraging in the reader capacities of judgment and sensitivity that can and should be expressed in the choices a citizen makes. Fiction shapes the reader's sense of who they are and what they might be. Robinson Crusoe is an exemplary text for study in that respect because it so clearly encouraged readers of its own time to identify with an individualistic, enlightened and enterprising everyman figure who nevertheless has adventures that were not remotely possible for the average reader. Participating in the fantasy of the narrative, readers are encouraged to sympathize with and admire Robinson Crusoe as they vicariously participate in a colonial adventure and a test of individual self-reliance. Furthermore, readers are encouraged through that identification with Crusoe to share in his values. The third part of my lecture is concerned with Robinson Crusoe, the novel. And I will focus on aspects of the actual text that relate to the ideas that I've already talked about so far in the lecture. All of you should be able to read about the journey and the shipwreck of Alexander Selkirk, a published account which served as one of the several models for Daniel Defoe. Most introductions to copies of Robinson Crusoe will give you plenty of information on the background to Alexander Selkirk's narrative, a real narrative of being marooned on an island and rescued. Now, to recap on what I said earlier, such narratives and travel writing in general had become a very popular and, importantly, a very commercially successful form of publication by the second decade of the 18th century. So Daniel Defoe, in taking the travelogue and turning it into something new, into this novel, is buying into and investing in a form of publication that in itself will make money. Not least, that was because improvements in the printing trade and the final lapse of the restrictive censorship of the Licensing Act in 1695, which had led to a virtual explosion in the available of commercially printed literature, but which had also increased the huge amount of money to be made out of ocean-bound trade, and also the corresponding discovery of new people, new places that had rendered the subject of sea travel utterly fascinating to the British public. If we look at the title page of Robinson Crusoe, there we are, we see immediately that the book actually looks like an authentic account of a real sailor's experiences. Indeed, it purports to be a true life account, narrated by a real mariner. Yet it is a work of prose fiction, a novel. If you look down here, we've got, whoops, go back to this just a moment, written by himself, The Life and Strange Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe of York, Mariner. Now, for anybody who is curious to find out about these kinds of publications, if you go to the University e-library, look in the British Periodicals database and search for this kind of travel narrative, you'll find lots of examples of real-life accounts that sailors had published, where the title page, if you were to look at them, looks very much like what you're seeing here. Let's look at for a moment at what type of narrative Robinson Crusoe is. It is written using the first-person pronoun I. We have a first-person narrator, if you like, the himself of the title page, which gives the impression of personal experience, creates a sense of familiarity between the reader and the author, and imparts a sense of authenticity to the narrative. The original title page suggests as much even before the reader turns to the first page of the story. That narrative technique of a first-person informal address to the reader simulates a condition of dialogue and confidentiality as Crusoe begins to tell his reader about his experiences. The first-person narrator also emphasizes the idea of authority and links the idea of authority, authorship, and authenticity to the hero of the novel as an individual, middling sort of member of modern civil society who Defoe hoped his readers would identify with. In terms of the Enlightenment, it allows the ordinary reader to represent his own life as something of interest, both to himself and to others. And Robinson Crusoe keeps revisiting what has happened several times over during the narrative to other people. It also offers the reader escapism, in other words, the exercise of the imagination, of vicarious encounters with strange people and strange places, encouraging the reader in the process to believe and understand how everyday knowledge might be used to make sense of a number of situations, strange situations, in ways that are always eventually turned to advantage. Crusoe's ordinariness is essential to that process because he has to be credible as far as possible and easy to identify with. Providence is a word much used in Robinson Crusoe, and it is a principle that, along with determined self-reliance, dominates the narrative. Providence, indeed, brings together religious and secular meaning through the motif of Crusoe's enterprise, for it means both the wisdom, care, and guidance believed to be provided by God, on the one hand, and good judgment and foresight on the part of the individual in his management of affairs and resources on the other. So the idea of providence is at one and the same time both linked to religious faith and to personal foresight and judgment. Robinson Crusoe underscores the Enlightenment's conclusion that self-interest motivates men's actions from the state of nature through into modern civil society. The novel takes the form of a flashback, as I mentioned earlier, and the title character recalls the events of his life in the interest of building a fortune through advantage. I mentioned earlier what must surely be obvious, that Robinson Crusoe is best known for its account of the title character's time in a single place, on a Caribbean island. Yet, as I say, the book is equally a travel narrative. It is a book about journeys from one place to another. Throughout the novel, Crusoe undertakes several journeys. Some are short and others are longer. In each case, there is a consideration of whether those journeys accord with his father's advice, which usually they do not, or whether they accord with his own better judgment, more debatable. Paternal objections to his adventures are made clear on the first page of the novel when Crusoe recalls, "I would be satisfied with nothing but going to sea, and my inclination to this led me so strongly against the will, nay, the commands of my father, a wise and grave man, gave me serious and excellent counsel against what he foresaw was my design. He asked me what reasons more than a mere wandering inclination I had for leaving my father's house, and my native country." In those recollections of his father's initial stern warnings, 3 words stand out, and they are key to understanding the Enlightenment context of Robinson Crusoe. Those words are reason on the one hand, wandering inclination on the other, which is clearly connected to imagination. Reason, wandering, and inclination. Robinson Crusoe's father is concerned that his son lacks reason, and that digression, a form of involuntary wandering, distracts from the purpose that should be the course of his life. In fact, Robinson Crusoe will alternate throughout the fiction between periods of reasoned, rational behaviour and less ordered, more emotionally driven interludes. The latter are indeed always only interludes, for organisation and the applied use of practical knowledge always prevail. It is possible to see the geography of the island on which he finds himself eventually marooned as a metaphor for the 2 sides of Robinson Crusoe's mind. On the one hand, we have the rational side where the stockade is built and where he believes himself to be firmly and safely in control of his situation. That part of the island is easy to colonise. The ground is more or less level, with the conveniently available elevations contributing to a panoramic view that is conducive to a safe existence. That is where Robinson Crusoe chooses to live. Now, let's compare that landscape for a moment with the other side of the island, which lies out of sight of the stockade, hidden behind a ridge of hills that must be circumnavigated by sea or surmounted through arduous climbing. On that other side of the island, Crusoe's experience of his environment changes. It becomes one of exotic sensual experience. He comes across a jungle environment in which he can't see clearly. He fears a loss of control over events at the same time that he relishes the excitement. And this is the side of the island at the far end of which there is something that he fears will consume him, the cannibals. Of course, he fears that side of the island, indeed, is where savages live and where they commit their cannibalistic acts. They represent his ultimate horror and the fear of otherness. But that fear of otherness, I would argue, might be understood as a projection of his own self out of control, his fear of losing control of his own rational mind, and his fear of his feelings, his passions, consuming that more orderly, rational self. That side of the island is also a place of thrall to sensuality and desire, for there can be no mistaking the nature of Crusoe's words when he recalls, "I descended a little into that delicious vale, surveying it with a secret kind of pleasure." You can see how guilt is associated with that side of the island. "I saw here an abundance of cocoa trees, orange and lemon and citron trees, all wild, and very few bearing any fruit, at least not then. However, the green limes that I gathered were not only pleasant to eat, but were very wholesome. And I mixed their juice afterwards with water, which made it very wholesome and very cool and refreshing. And I think that venture into the other side of the island clearly establishes Crusoe's wrestling with his own mind. And of course, he goes back to the flatter side of the island where he has built his stockade into which he can retreat and where he sets himself up as basically the king and master of the island. There are certain moods that Crusoe goes through while he's on the island. I've put some of these on the slide here that you might like to think about. And you might like to think about how these fit into the motif of keeping accounts of one's behaviour and of keeping accounts that divide things into reason and passion, the good and the bad, and the profit and loss. He goes through moments when he's pragmatic and rational. At times he's excited and sensual. He experiences both terror and pleasure. He weighs sentiment against capitalism. The novel looks at the idea of fantasy versus reality, and it's concerned with, as I said earlier, self-interest against institutional duty. And ultimately, there is Robinson Crusoe, the capitalist, who seeks both to rationally make money, but to also indulge his own pleasures. But only indulge his own pleasures insofar as they bring some benefits to him. The journey to the other side of the island, like those back and forth to salvage goods from the wrecked ship, are situated within an overall narrative of exploratory voyages that require, on the one hand, a sense of purpose, reasoned purpose, and on the other hand, a certain intrepidity of spirit, a certain desire to find the new, to experience new, to experience things that haven't been experienced before. And again, there is that balancing in the novel between the sense of purpose, the purpose of a voyage, and the excitement of intrepid adventure. They develop the theme of a desire for travel and an urgent restlessness of spirit. They dramatize hazardous encounter in the quest for experience on the one hand and adventure on the other. The use of old and new knowledge, handed down and empirically gained, to assert one's power over foreign lands and people. The decision early on in the novel over what to take on escape from slavery in Sallee and what to leave, including his fellow slaves, Moley and Zuri. And those decisions repeated in the selective salvaging of goods from the wreck of the ship, of Crusoe's ship, and later from the Spanish shipwreck. Now, each of those episodes contributes in its own way to the adventure story, but can be read as metaphorical of Crusoe's consideration of what is, on the one hand, epistemologically useful to him, and on the other hand, what can easily or best be left behind. From the first shipwreck, he salvages, amongst other things, food, weapons, a carpenter's chest, planks, ropes, and rigging. On the last of his initial 12 visits to the ship, he finds money, quote, about £36 in value, some of it's European, some Brazilian money, and some gold and silver. Now, initially, he says that he does not want it. "O drug," I said aloud, "what good art thou? Thou art not worth to me, no, not the taking off the ground." And you might consider the biblical kind of language here that Defoe is drawing on. However, he changes his mind, notably changes his mind, and decides, upon second thoughts, I took it away. Crusoe can never leave money behind. The Enlightenment manner of reappraising received existing knowledge from rational and empirical perspectives has already been covered on other texts that you've read on your course. As further secondary reading, the drive to put things into order according to kind and to establish hierarchies of importance during the Enlightenment is well treated by Michel Foucault in his important book, The Order of Things. Crusoe does not only retain what is useful in practical ways. His decision at the end of the period of salvage of the shipwreck to bring with him 2 cats and a dog is evidence of his acknowledgement of his need for emotional fulfillment. In practice, he quickly turns those animals, and others, the goats on the island, birds, into loyal subjects that need his protection, in return for which they offer him his loyalty and affection. I think you can see where I'm going here. Likewise, Crusoe's carefully controlled forays into the wilder side of the island can be interpreted as a controlled and necessary exercise of his imagination. Such adventure leads to the apparent confirmation of his fear of cannibalism, the realization of superstition about losing self-control, of being overwhelmed by the other, that is both a displacement and projection of the uncontrolled self, as well as of a learned fear of foreignness. No lecture on Robinson Crusoe would be complete without some attention to cannibals and slavery. As Peter Hume, professor in our own Department of Literature, Film and Theatre Studies, has argued in his monumentally influential book Colonial Encounters, ever since Europe arrived in America in 1492, with the meeting of cultures geographically described in Christopher Columbus's logbook, stories of peaceful savages and cruel cannibals have formed the matrix for all subsequent descriptions of native Caribbean society. Peter Hume explores the origins of the word cannibal and Carib, showing how they are inseparably linked as products and constructions of the European imagination. You might like to read his chapter, which locates Robinson Crusoe within the European history of discovery and with the history of colonialist literature about the Caribbean, stressing that there is a danger in overemphasizing Crusoe's concern with accountancy at the expense of the rest of the text. That chapter's focus on the narrative of colonial acquisition notes that after 30 years of careful management by others in Robinson Crusoe's absence, Crusoe finds himself not only the owner of a Caribbean island, but also the master of an estate in the Brazils. Hume points out that the cannibals are not the only violent presence in Robinson Crusoe, for the colonial enterprise itself was premised upon violent presence and violent conquest. Crusoe notes, after firing his gun, that he was hearing on the island, that he was hearing the first gun that had been fired there since the creation of the world. Robinson Crusoe is thrilled by his own power and by his potential to conquer and subdue others. And I've put a number of quotes up here that you might like to look at there. For now, I would like to emphasize Robinson Crusoe's selection of Friday as a project for rescue from his own cannibalistic culture, his subsequent education in English morality and the Christian religion that enacts the colonial project to civilize the other and to exploit that other, an other that has already been demonized through the media of language, religion, and political expedience that categorizes it as savage. Friday has no voice of his own in Robinson Crusoe. Rather, his speech is told through Crusoe's own narrative using a broken form of English that humorously constructs him as primitive. Yes, yes, he says, you teach ye me you good. You do great deal much good, he says. You teach wild mans, be good, sober, tame mans. This is Robinson Crusoe's phonetic transcription of Man Friday that constructs him as primitive, constructs him in need of education, and through education converts him into a loyal subject. And it indicates the values that colonial subjects were meant to respect in their European superiors, namely through teaching, through goodness, through soberness, as opposed to their condition of native wildness. Crusoe, in return, finds in all Friday's discourse a settled affection toward me. And you can see again how that narrative is looking at Crusoe as somebody who can be turned into someone to his own advantage. The urge to tame the colonized other contributes to Robinson Crusoe's exploration of fear, desire, and the effects of the subconscious imagination. Those experiences, fear, desire, and the subconscious, are treated as the debit side of the double entry ledger of experience that configures rationalism and enterprise as the credit side of the balance. In other words, it is necessary to knowledge to balance the books of understanding. but only insofar as they are always outweighed, the irrational always outweighs its counterpart. In actual financial terms and metaphorically, Robinson Crusoe never allows himself to remain long in debt. Now, I want to conclude by suggesting that Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe anticipates many later Enlightenment texts that you will be reading, and that it is a part of an intellectual dialogue that informs those later productions. Those works include Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, with its analysis of individualism, of self-interest, and of the division of labour. It informs Voltaire's wonderfully satirical novel about politics and society, Candide, on which I'll be lecturing after Christmas. Candide tells a travel narrative. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's discourse on inequality that looks at the concept of the noble savage and the turning of the first piece of land into private property as the moment in which inequality enters human society. To recall two earlier texts that were influential on Defoe, Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan and John Locke's two treatises on government and an essay concerning human understanding, are seminal to Defoe's thought. Indeed, Locke would be invoked time and again to justify the colonization of lands where it was argued that native populations were failing to maximize the potential for the improvement on nature as a duty to God, as indeed had already been argued and would be further argued with the case of Native Americans. Crusoe says of his situation on the island, early in his time there, I was lord of the whole manor, or if I pleased, I might call myself king, or emperor over the whole country which I had possession of. There were no rivals, I had no competitor, none to dispute sovereignty or to command with me. He continues, my island was now peopled, and I thought myself very rich in subjects, and it was a merry reflection, which I frequently made, how like a king I looked. First of all, the whole country was my own property, so that I had an undoubted right of dominion. Secondly, my people were perfectly subjected. I was absolutely lord and lawgiver. They all owed their lives to me and were ready to lay down their lives if there had been an occasion for it for me. And I think you can see from this quotation where Robinson Crusoe fits into the studies of the relationship between monarchy, between a population transferring its own rights within society to a government, to an overall sovereign, and what that idea of sovereignty meant, both in terms of the individual as sovereign over their own lives, and also in terms of government of the nation. And I'll leave the lecture there and hope that you very much that you will enjoy reading Robinson Crusoe and talking about it in your seminars this week. I look forward to seeing you after Christmas and lecturing to you on Voltaire's Candide. Great novel, great fun. Thank you, everybody.